The moment my wife dumped a bucket of dirty mop water over my head, everyone in the ballroom laughed. What they didn't know was that every paycheck in that room ultimately came from me. The water hit first. Cold, foul, and heavy. It rolled down the shoulders of my charcoal suit and dripped from my sleeves onto the polished marble floor. For a second, nobody moved. Then came the laughter. Loud, comfortable. The kind of laughter people share when they believe they're standing on the winning side of a story. I stood perfectly still beneath the crystal chandeliers while muddy water gathered around my dress shoes. The annual Walker Industrial Excellence Gala was supposed to celebrate another record-breaking year. Hundreds of employees filled the ballroom of the Grand Crescent Hotel in downtown Dallas. White tablecloths stretched beneath gold centerpieces. Waiters moved between tables carrying glasses of sparkling water and expensive steaks. A jazz band played softly near the stage. Everything smelled like money, success, and polished appearances. Then Victoria ruined the illusion. My wife stood 10 feet away holding the empty bucket. Her emerald evening dress shimmered beneath the lights. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Around her, members of her family looked delighted. My father-in-law Thomas Walker leaned back in his chair grinning. My brother-in-law Jason nearly spilled his drink from laughing so hard. Even Melissa, Victoria's younger sister, covered her mouth while trying to hide a smile that wasn't hidden at all. The room fed off their reaction. More laughter spread. More whispers followed. I could hear pieces of conversations floating through the ballroom air. Poor guy? About time somebody put him in his place. I always wondered why she stayed with him. I lowered my eyes toward the water dripping from my cuff. 20 years. 20 years of building something extraordinary. 20 years of staying invisible. 20 years of allowing people to believe whatever version of me made them comfortable. Funny how quickly people decide who matters and who doesn't. Victoria took a step forward and raised her voice so the entire ballroom could hear. Maybe now you'll stop embarrassing me. More laughter followed. She folded her arms. You contribute nothing. You sit at home while real people work. You're the reason everyone feels sorry for me. The audience loved it. I could see it in their faces. They thought they were watching a man finally get exposed. They thought this was justice. They thought they understood the story. The truth was much simpler. They knew absolutely nothing. Across the ballroom, standing near the stage, Richard Bennett looked like he had stopped breathing. Most people didn't notice him. They were too busy enjoying the spectacle. But I noticed. Richard's face had gone pale. His champagne glass remained frozen halfway to his mouth. Our eyes met for less than a second. That was enough. He knew. He understood exactly how dangerous this moment had become. Victoria didn't notice. Neither did her family. They kept smiling. They kept laughing. They kept digging. I slowly removed a folded handkerchief from my pocket and wiped a streak of dirty water from my face. The ballroom gradually quieted. Not because they felt guilty. They were waiting for my reaction. People always expect noise. Anger. Excuses. Defensiveness. They expect a man being humiliated to perform for them. I gave them none of it. My heartbeat remained steady. My breathing remained calm. The silence stretched across the room. Somewhere behind me, a glass clinked against silverware. The jazz band had stopped playing. Every eye remained fixed on me. Victoria shook her head. Look at him. He doesn't even have enough pride to walk away. I almost smiled. Pride had nothing to do with it. Experience did. Experience teaches you that the most powerful move is often the quietest one. I glanced down once more at the dirty water spreading across the marble floor. Then I looked directly at Richard Bennett, the CEO of the company, the man everyone in the ballroom believed held the highest authority in the organization. My voice came out calm and steady, quiet enough to sound controlled, loud enough for every person in the room to hear. Richard, I said, I think it's time. The color drained completely from his face. And suddenly, nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody spoke. The silence that settled over the ballroom felt heavier than the laughter that had filled it seconds earlier. Richard Bennett stood motionless near the stage, his fingers still wrapped around the stem of a champagne glass. I watched him carefully. The room watched him too. Most people assumed he was confused. He was not confused. He was calculating. 3 hours earlier, this night had looked very different. The ballroom had been quiet then. Workers adjusted centerpieces. Event staff tested microphones. The band rehearsed near the stage while sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Dallas. Everything appeared normal. Victoria arrived early with her family. They occupied a private lounge reserved for executives and their guests. I was not there. At least, they believed I was not there. The lounge door remained partially open while employees moved equipment through the hallway. Voices carried farther than people realize when they assume nobody important is listening. Jason Walker was the loudest. He always was. He sat with his feet propped on a leather chair, laughing while scrolling through his phone. "Tonight is the night," he said. "Either he finally gets embarrassed enough to leave, or Victoria files next week." Laughter followed. Thomas Walker took a slow sip of coffee. "The man should have left years ago. I still do not understand why she married him in the first place." Victoria did not answer immediately. She stared into a mirror while adjusting an emerald earring. Finally, she shrugged. He was different back then. Different. It was amazing how one word could erase 20 years. 20 years of loyalty. 20 years of support. 20 years of choosing the same person every day. Different. Melissa leaned forward. "You cannot keep dragging him around forever. People talk." Victoria smiled. Not cruelly. Not yet. More like someone trying to convince herself of a decision she had already made. "Trust me. After tonight, nobody will have to wonder anymore." The room chuckled. Then came the bucket. It sat near the corner of the lounge beside a janitorial cart. Jason noticed it first. That would make a statement. Thomas laughed. Melissa laughed harder. Victoria looked at the bucket for several seconds. Nobody objected. Nobody suggested acting like adults. Nobody asked whether public humiliation might be crossing a line. They simply kept building the idea together. One joke became another. One comment became a plan. By the time they left the lounge, everyone seemed excited. Funny how people convince themselves that cruelty becomes acceptable when enough others approve of it. I remember standing farther down the hallway after they walked away. The city skyline reflected against the glass beside me. Cars moved through evening traffic hundreds of feet below. My reflection stared back from the window. Gray suit, silver hair at the temples, calm expression, the image of a man nobody considered important. I should have been angry. Instead, I felt something else. Clarity. Because the truth was, this was not the beginning of anything. It was the end. The final page of a story that had been writing itself for years. Victoria had not always been like this. When we first met, she worked long hours and dreamed big dreams. We rented a tiny apartment outside Fort Worth. The air conditioner barely worked during Texas summers. We shared cheap furniture and grocery store coffee. Back then she laughed at everything. Back then she believed character mattered more than status. Somewhere along the way that changed. Maybe it happened gradually. Maybe success changed the people around her. Maybe the constant praise became addictive. Looking back, I could see dozens of moments I ignored. Small comments. Dismissive smiles. Introductions where she forgot to mention I was her husband. Tiny cracks spreading across a foundation I thought was solid. The dangerous thing about slow change is that you rarely notice it while it is happening. You only recognize it after the distance becomes impossible to ignore. By 7 o'clock that evening, guests filled the ballroom. Music echoed beneath the chandeliers. Laughter bounced from table to table. Victoria moved through the crowd like royalty. Her family followed close behind. They believed they were celebrating another successful year. They believed they were untouchable. And as I stood quietly near the back of the room watching it all unfold, I realized something none of them understood yet. The most important decisions of the night had already been made. People like simple stories. They like knowing who the winner is before the game ends. They see an old pickup truck and assume the man driving it never succeeded. They see a quiet husband standing in the corner of a ballroom and assume he is nothing worth saying. Most of the people at that gala had already decided who I was long before they ever met me. The truth was, I spent years helping them believe it. Back when Walker Industrial was nothing more than an idea scribbled across legal pads and coffee-stained notebooks, nobody wanted to invest. Banks said the market was too crowded. Consultants said the risk was too high. Friends suggested safer paths. I was 28 years old with a small office, a folding desk, and enough determination to ignore advice from people who had never built anything themselves. I worked 18-hour days. Some nights I slept on a couch beside my desk because driving home felt like a waste of time. The first warehouse we rented had a leaking roof. During storms, buckets lined the concrete floor to catch water dripping from the ceiling. The air smelled like dust, machine oil, and ambition. Most people only see successful companies after the hard years are gone. They never see the sacrifices hiding underneath. I built Walker Industrial one contract at a time. One client became 3. 3 became 12. 12 became 50. Slowly, the company grew beyond anything I imagined. New facilities opened across Texas, then Oklahoma, then Louisiana. The numbers climbed. Revenue expanded. Opportunities multiplied. Success arrived quietly at first, and then all at once. That was when I made the decision that confused everyone who later learned the truth. I stepped back, not because I was tired, not because I lost interest, because I understood something most entrepreneurs learn too late. Visibility creates targets. The more attention you attract, the less freedom you keep. So I restructured everything. Ownership moved into trusts. Layers of legal protection separated me from public records. Professional executives handled operations. Boards managed governance. Lawyers spent months building a structure designed to survive generations. I remained the beneficial owner while disappearing from the spotlight. The arrangement worked exactly as intended. Reporters stopped calling. Competitors stopped watching. People stopped asking questions. And eventually they stopped noticing me altogether. Years later, when Richard Bennett became chief executive officer, he understood the arrangement immediately. Richard was smart enough to respect systems larger than himself. He knew who owned the company. He knew where final authority rested. More importantly, he knew why the structure existed. We spoke only when necessary. Sometimes months passed between conversations. The company flourished without needing my public presence. I preferred it that way. Around that same period, Victoria's family entered the picture. Thomas Walker joined as a regional operations manager. Jason followed several years later. Melissa eventually moved into marketing. One by one, they built careers inside the organization. Promotions arrived. Salaries increased. Benefits expanded. Their success was genuine. They worked hard. But over time, something else grew alongside that success. Entitlement. People often mistake access for ownership. They spend enough time around power that they begin believing power belongs to them. I noticed the shift long before anyone else did. Conversations changed. Gratitude disappeared. Assumptions replaced humility. The company became something they spoke about as though it existed solely for their benefit. Still, I stayed quiet. Maybe because I believed character reveals itself eventually. Maybe because I hoped Victoria would remain different from the people influencing her. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs. They were everywhere. Small comments during family dinners. Casual dismissals. Jokes that carried more truth than humor. None of it happened overnight. Respect rarely disappears all at once. It erodes gradually, like stone beneath running water. By the time people notice the damage, the foundation is already weakened. Standing in that ballroom with dirty water drying across my suit, I realized something important. None of them truly knew me. Not Victoria. Not her family. Not most of the executives sitting beneath those chandeliers. They knew the version of me they had created in their minds. They knew the harmless husband, the quiet observer, the man they could laugh at without consequence. And that misunderstanding was about to become very expensive. The strange thing about success is that it rarely changes people overnight. It changes them in inches, small enough that nobody notices until years have passed. Standing there in the ballroom, I found myself thinking about the first family dinner I ever shared with the Walkers. Back then, Thomas drove a 10-year-old pickup truck with a cracked dashboard. Linda worked part-time at a local insurance office. Jason was still trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. Melissa was finishing college. They were ordinary people with ordinary worries. Mortgage payments, medical bills, student loans. The same concerns shared by millions of families across America. I liked them. I genuinely did. They were warm, ambitious, and grateful for opportunities when they came. When Thomas joined Walker Industrial, he worked hard. Nobody handed him success. He earned promotions through long hours and consistent results. Jason followed a few years later and surprised everyone with his ability to manage large projects. Melissa proved herself in marketing. Watching them grow professionally felt rewarding. I took pride in seeing people build better lives. That was always one of my favorite parts of business, creating opportunities that changed entire families. What I never expected was how quickly prosperity could rewrite memory. As the years passed, the conversations changed. The modest house became a larger one. Then came luxury vacations, new vehicles, country club memberships, expensive watches. None of those things bothered me. Success should improve quality of life. The problem was not what they bought. The problem was what they started believing. Somewhere along the way, they stopped viewing success as something they had achieved together and began treating it as something they inherently deserved. Gratitude slowly disappeared. Humility followed. The first time I noticed it clearly was during a Thanksgiving dinner almost 6 years earlier. Thomas sat at the head of the table, describing a recent company expansion. Family members listened like he was discussing his own empire. Every accomplishment belonged to him. Every victory reflected his leadership. Every growth milestone became evidence of his brilliance. I remember sitting quietly while everyone nodded. Nobody knew the irony except me. Not because I wanted recognition. I did not. What struck me was how easily people confuse participation with ownership. Thomas never once asked how the company started. He never wondered who built the foundation beneath his success. He simply accepted the benefits and assumed they would exist forever. Victoria gradually followed the same path. At first, the changes were subtle. She started introducing me differently. Early in our marriage, I was her husband. Later, I became Cole. Then eventually, I became almost invisible. At company functions, she spent less time beside me. Conversations became shorter. Her attention shifted toward status, titles, and influence. The woman who once admired character began measuring people by different standards. I kept hoping it was temporary. Everyone goes through phases. Everyone gets distracted. But years passed, and the distance continued growing. There were moments that should have warned me. Moments I dismissed because love has a way of editing reality. One evening after a company charity event, Victoria casually mentioned that some executives found me difficult to understand. I asked what she meant. She laughed and said they could not figure out why someone with so little ambition seemed perfectly content. Little ambition. The phrase stayed with me for weeks. Not because it hurt, because it revealed how completely she misunderstood the man she married. I had spent decades building something large enough to support thousands of employees and their families. Yet the absence of public attention convinced people I had accomplished nothing. The irony almost made me smile. By the time we arrived at the gala that evening, the transformation was complete. The walkers no longer saw themselves as beneficiaries of opportunity. They saw themselves as pillars holding everything together. They believed the company needed them more than they needed the company. That belief gave them confidence. It also made them careless. People are most vulnerable when they stop questioning their assumptions. Looking around the ballroom at the expensive suits, crystal glasses, and confident smiles, I realized nearly everyone in that room shared the same misunderstanding. They believed power always announces itself. They believed the most important person would naturally stand at the center of attention. In less than a few minutes, they were about to discover how wrong that assumption could be. The hardest lessons rarely arrive in dramatic moments. Most of the time they arrive disguised as ordinary conversations. Looking back, the end of my marriage was not hidden inside that ballroom. It had been unfolding for years in quiet moments that seemed insignificant at the time. One memory kept returning as I stood there watching the crowd wait for whatever would happen next. About 3 years earlier, Victoria and I attended a charity fundraiser hosted by several major companies in Dallas. The event was elegant but predictable. White linen tables, soft music, endless speeches about community partnerships and future growth. I remember standing beside a window overlooking the city while Victoria spoke with a group of executives. At one point, one of them asked what I did. Before I could answer, Victoria laughed lightly and said, "Cole enjoys staying out of the spotlight." It sounded harmless. Everyone smiled. The conversation moved on. Yet something about it lingered. Not because she lied. Because she reduced an entire lifetime of work into a sentence designed to make me disappear. Similar moments became more frequent after that. At dinner parties, she rarely included me in professional conversations. During company events, she drifted farther away. Sometimes I would spend entire evenings watching her move through crowds while introducing everyone else with enthusiasm. Executives, directors, investors, consultants. Meanwhile, I became an afterthought, the husband standing quietly in the background. At first, I convinced myself it did not matter. Confidence makes it easy to ignore small insults. The problem is that repeated disrespect accumulates. One drop means nothing. 1,000 drops reshape stone. Around 2 years before the gala, Victoria started making comments that felt different, less playful, more revealing. One evening we were driving home after a corporate dinner. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while downtown lights reflected across wet pavement. Out of nowhere she asked why I never pursued something bigger. I remember smiling because the question sounded absurd. Bigger than what? She gestured vaguely toward the skyline. Bigger opportunities. Bigger influence. Bigger visibility. She spoke as if success only counted when strangers recognized your name. I asked whether visibility mattered more than freedom. She laughed and said that sounded like something a man says when he has already given up. I said nothing after that, not because I lacked an answer, because I realized we were no longer discussing the same definition of success. Another memory surfaced. Last Christmas, the Walker family gathered inside Thomas and Linda's new house. The living room was decorated with expensive furniture and oversized holiday displays. During dinner, Jason spent nearly an hour talking about his promotion. Everyone congratulated him. Then someone asked whether I planned to do anything ambitious in the coming year. Before I could respond, Jason smirked and said, "Cole's retirement strategy seems to be existing." The table laughed. Victoria laughed too. Not loudly, not maliciously, but she laughed. I remember looking at her across the table. She never noticed. That moment told me more than any argument could have. Respect had quietly left the room years earlier. The woman sitting across from me no longer saw me clearly. She saw a story she had constructed, a comfortable narrative where she was rising and I was standing still. What she never understood was that stillness and weakness are not the same thing. The strongest foundations remain invisible after the building is finished. Nobody admires concrete beneath the ground. They admire glass towers reaching toward the sky. Yet without the foundation, everything collapses. The irony was almost painful. The very company that elevated her family had become the lens through which they judged me. Every promotion increased their confidence. Every success reinforced their assumptions. They believed proximity to power made them powerful. They believed titles created importance. They believed influence was permanent. Standing beneath those chandeliers with dirty water drying against my sleeves, I finally accepted a truth I had avoided for too long. Victoria was not humiliating a stranger that night. She was humiliating the man she thought I was. And in a matter of moments, she was about to discover how wrong she had been all along. The room had been moving toward that moment all evening. Looking back, the bucket was never the real humiliation. It was simply the final act in a performance that had been building for hours. Long before the water hit my suit, the comments had already started. Small at first, easy to dismiss if you wanted to preserve the illusion that everyone was joking. When I arrived at the gala, Thomas Walker greeted me with a smile that never reached his eyes. He looked me up and down and asked whether I finally decided to buy a proper suit. Several people nearby laughed. I smiled politely and shook his hand. 10 minutes later, Jason stopped me near the bar and asked whether retirement was getting boring. Before I could answer, he launched into a story about a major project his team had completed. The story lasted 5 minutes. The message lasted much longer. Around us, executives nodded while he described himself as one of the company's future leaders. Nobody mentioned that the company existed long before Jason arrived. Nobody mentioned that it would continue long after he was gone. As the evening progressed, the comments became sharper. Melissa joked that I had somehow mastered the art of attending company functions without contributing to the company. A vice president laughed a little too hard. Another executive smirked into his drink. Every remark encouraged the next one. Confidence spreads quickly when people believe there are no consequences. Victoria watched it all happen. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she added her own comments. Not once did she stop it. That hurt more than any insult coming from strangers. There is a particular loneliness that comes from standing beside someone who should defend you and realizing they no longer want to. By 8 o'clock, the ballroom glowed beneath golden chandeliers. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying dessert plates. Conversations blended into a steady hum of laughter and music. Richard Bennett stood near the stage preparing for his annual address. The board members occupied a table near the front. Investors filled another section. Everyone looked comfortable, successful, certain of their place in the world. Then Victoria decided to make sure I knew mine. She approached our table holding a champagne glass. Several members of her family gathered nearby, as if anticipating entertainment. Her smile looked rehearsed. "Tell everyone what you do all day, Cole," she said. A few people turned toward us. More eyes followed. I answered honestly. I told her I spent most of my time reading, reviewing reports, traveling occasionally, and enjoying a quieter life. Jason laughed immediately. That sounds like a professional spectator. More laughter followed. Victoria shook her head dramatically. See what I deal with. The crowd rewarded her with smiles and knowing looks. What fascinated me was how eager people were to participate. Human beings love certainty. Give them a target and many will join simply because everyone else already has. The next 20 minutes felt like a slow public trial. Every achievement I never discussed became evidence that I had none. Every private choice became proof of failure. Through it all, I remained calm. Not because the comments did not matter, because anger would have given them exactly what they wanted. Then came the moment. Someone rolled a janitorial cart through a side entrance after a minor spill near the back of the ballroom. Most people ignored it. Victoria did not. Her eyes found the bucket almost immediately. Jason noticed too. Their expressions met. A silent conversation passed between them. The kind that lasts only seconds but changes everything afterward. Victoria walked across the room and returned carrying the bucket. At first, several guests thought it was part of a joke. Phones appeared. Smiles widened. Anticipation spread through the crowd. I remember noticing Richard from across the ballroom. He looked confused at first, then concerned, then alarmed. Victoria stopped a few feet away from me. Maybe this will finally wake you up, she said. The room erupted with laughter before anything even happened. They had already decided the ending. They believed they were watching the last chapter of a powerless man's story. What none of them realized was that the real story was only beginning. Richard Bennett set his champagne glass down with a care that immediately drew attention. The room had expected laughter, embarrassment, maybe an argument. What nobody expected was the chief executive officer walking away from the stage and moving directly toward me. The silence deepened with every step he took. Victoria noticed it first. Her smile faltered. Jason stopped laughing. Thomas straightened in his chair. Around the ballroom, conversations died one by one until the only sound left was the faint hum of the air conditioning above us. Richard stopped a few feet away and looked at me. Not at Victoria. Not at the board members. At me. His expression carried something most people in the room had never seen before. Respect. Mr. Harrison, he said quietly. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Victoria blinked. She had never heard him address me that way before. Richard cleared his throat and turned toward the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue tonight's program, there is something that needs to be clarified. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a drink. Every eye followed him. I remained standing exactly where I was, water still drying across my suit jacket. Richard motioned toward the stage. A member of the legal department hurried forward carrying a black portfolio. The attorney looked nervous. Not because he feared public speaking, because he understood what was about to happen. The portfolio was placed on the podium. Richard opened it carefully. Page after page of documents appeared beneath the ballroom lights. Corporate records, trust agreements, ownership structures, legal certifications. The kind of paperwork most people never see because it lives behind locked doors and confidential meetings. For nearly 2 decades, Richard began, Walker Industrial has operated under a private ownership structure. Confusion spread through the audience. I could see it in their faces. Investors leaned forward. Managers exchanged whispers. Board members sat frozen. Richard continued. Many people assume ownership and management are the same thing. They are not. He lifted a document from the portfolio. The beneficial owner of Walker Industrial has remained unchanged since the company was founded. The room seemed to hold its breath. Victoria looked from Richard to me and back again. Her expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty. Thomas frowned. Jason shook his head as if trying to dismiss what he was hearing. Richard placed the document beneath a projector camera. Instantly, the image appeared on massive screens hanging above the ballroom. Signatures, legal seals, trust records, names, lots of names, and one name repeated throughout every document. Cole Harrison. A ripple moved through the crowd. It started as whispers, then silence, then something even heavier than silence. Realization. The attorney stepped forward and confirmed the authenticity of the records. Another attorney followed, then a board member. One after another, people verified the same truth. The ownership structure was real. The records were valid. The authority was unquestionable. Victoria's face lost color. Jason stared at the screen as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Thomas looked suddenly older. Richard allowed several seconds to pass before speaking again. Every facility represented here tonight. Every division. Every subsidiary. Every executive appointment ultimately reports through a structure established by Mr. Harrison. Nobody laughed now. The same room that had mocked me minutes earlier sat perfectly still. The transformation was remarkable. Nothing about me had changed. I was wearing the same suit, standing in the same place, speaking the same number of words. The only difference was information. It is amazing how quickly people change their opinions once they learn a fact they should have known all along. Victoria finally found her voice. "That is impossible," she whispered. The words barely carried beyond her table. Richard looked at her with genuine sympathy. "No, Victoria," he said softly. "It is not impossible. It is simply true." I watched the realization spread across her face. Not all at once. Slowly, piece by piece, like sunlight reaching a dark room. She was replaying years of assumptions, years of comments, years of laughter, years of believing she understood the man standing beside her. And for the first time that night, she understood she never had. What happened next surprised almost everyone in the ballroom. People expected anger. They expected revenge delivered through humiliation. They expected the kind of dramatic outburst that fills headlines and office gossip for years. Instead, I simply picked up a clean napkin from a nearby table and dried my hands. The room watched every movement. Nobody seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Victoria stood frozen beside the empty bucket. Jason stared at the projection screen. Thomas looked as though he had aged a decade in the span of a few minutes. Richard remained beside the stage waiting for instructions. For years he had managed the company exactly as we agreed. He knew my preferences. He knew I believed systems mattered more than emotions. I glanced toward him and gave a small nod. That was all it took. Richard turned toward the audience. "Effective immediately," he said, "an independent compliance review will begin regarding several internal management decisions and executive conduct matters that have been pending evaluation." Confused murmurs spread through the ballroom. The announcement sounded ordinary to most people. It was not. Several executives immediately understood the significance. Compliance reviews do not begin without cause. Independent reviews do not happen without authority. The board members exchanged uneasy looks. Richard continued. "This review will include promotion procedures, vendor relationships, reporting structures, hiring recommendations, and leadership conduct standards." Jason's expression changed first. He understood exactly why those categories mattered. During the past few years, he had become comfortable assuming rules applied differently to him. Not illegally, not dramatically, just enough shortcuts, just enough favoritism, just enough confidence that nobody would ever question him. Thomas understood as well. So did Melissa. The problem with believing you are untouchable is that eventually you stop being careful. I had spent years observing, not interfering, observing. Every organization develops blind spots when people become too comfortable. Tonight did not create those blind spots. It simply exposed them. Victoria finally stepped toward me. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "Cole," she said quietly, "why did you never tell me?" The question almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it revealed everything. She was asking the wrong question. The real question was why she never cared enough to ask who I truly was. For years she accepted assumptions because assumptions were convenient. I looked at her calmly. "You stopped being interested in the answer a long time ago." Her eyes filled with regret. Not dramatic regret. The quieter kind. The kind people feel when they suddenly recognize a mistake that cannot be undone. Around us, employees whispered among themselves. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked shocked. A few looked frightened. But many simply looked thoughtful. They were replaying conversations. Replaying jokes. Replaying moments when they had followed the crowd because it felt safer than forming their own opinions. Richard spoke again. "No employment decisions are being announced tonight. However, all reviews will proceed according to company policy." That statement mattered. This was not punishment. This was accountability. There is a difference. Accountability relies on facts. Punishment relies on emotion. I had no interest in emotion anymore. The truth would be enough. One by one, People began understanding that reality. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a mirror. Everyone was seeing themselves reflected back through their own choices. Jason looked away first. Melissa lowered her eyes. Thomas stared silently at the floor. Victoria remained standing in front of me. The confidence that had carried her through the evening was gone. In its place stood uncertainty. The band remained silent. The chandeliers still glowed above us. Waiters stood motionless beside untouched dessert trays. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet the atmosphere had completely changed. Because power had not shifted. Power had always been exactly where it was now. The only thing that changed was that everyone could finally see it. 6 months later, the memory of that night felt less like a victory and more like a lesson. Time has a way of removing the noise and leaving only the truth behind. Walker Industrial continued to grow. The compliance reviews finished exactly the way they were supposed to. Facts replaced assumptions. Documentation replaced excuses. Policies were applied evenly. Some people kept their positions. Others did not. A few discovered that confidence is not the same thing as competence. Through it all, I stayed largely invisible. The company did not need a public hero. It needed stability. It needed leadership rooted in principles instead of emotion. The headlines never came because there were no headlines to write. No public scandal. No dramatic confrontation. Just consequences unfolding exactly as systems were designed to unfold. That was enough. I moved into a smaller home overlooking a quiet lake outside Dallas. Most mornings began with coffee on the porch and the sound of water moving gently against the shoreline. For the first time in years, the silence felt peaceful instead of lonely. I spent more time traveling, more time reading, more time appreciating things that cannot be measured by titles or salaries. One cool October afternoon, I received a message asking whether I would be willing to meet. The name attached to the request did not surprise me. Victoria. We met at a small cafe near the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just wooden tables, warm lighting, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air. When she walked in, I almost did not recognize her. Not because she looked older, because she looked quieter. The confidence that once filled every room had softened into something more reflective. She sat across from me and wrapped both hands around a coffee cup. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked up. I spent months trying to understand what happened, she said. Not that night. The years before it. I listened. She took a slow breath. I kept telling myself that I was disappointed in you. Then I realized I never really knew you anymore. There was no anger in her voice. No attempt to shift blame. Just honesty. The kind that usually arrives after consequences have already done their work. We talked for nearly an hour. About choices. About assumptions. About how easy it is to overlook the people closest to us while chasing things that seem important in the moment. At one point, she asked whether I could ever forgive her. I thought carefully before answering. I already have. Tears filled her eyes. Then why can we not start over? She asked softly. I looked through the window toward the lake beyond the parking lot. The water reflected the afternoon sun like polished glass. It was beautiful because it was still, because it had stopped fighting itself. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, I said. One heals the past. The other builds the future. She lowered her eyes and nodded. I think she understood before I finished speaking. Some doors closed quietly. Not because people stopped caring. Because life moves in different directions. When we stood to leave, she thanked me. I wished her well. Then we walked towards separate cars beneath a sky painted orange and gold by the setting Texas sun. I never saw her again after that day. Sometimes people ask what the biggest lesson was. Was it about money? Power? Success? The answer is none of those things. The real lesson is that respect matters long before anyone learns your title. Character matters long before anyone sees your bank account. And the way we treat people reveals far more about us than it does about them. As I drove home that evening, the road stretched ahead beneath a fading sunset. The world felt lighter somehow. Not because I had won, because I no longer needed to prove anything. And now that you have reached the end of this story, I am curious about your thoughts. What would you have done if you were standing in my shoes that night? Would you have walked away, spoken up sooner, or handled it exactly the same way? Share your perspective. And if stories about resilience, respect, and unexpected lessons resonate with you, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next one. Sometimes the quietest stories leave the deepest mark.